you know the residents, and you have friends and you have family here. So you're really invested in your community as a steward or a public servant for your community. So when these disasters happen, that's where your mindset is first, is public safety.
Welcome to the Level Design Podcast, a podcast for architects and engineers who want to thrive in this industry by creating more freedom, fulfillment, and financial security. Join us in uncovering how to restore value and honor to the unique people who choose to be designers and caretakers of our built world, and why it's essential to the future of our society, our industry, and our planet.
I would say let's start with maybe just our intent of this podcast, because it is different than our normal podcasts, which are usually about engineering and the history of engineering and cool, nerdy things we love. This one's going to be a little bit more about what's happening outside of our world as engineers in these fires. We have Allison James here, of course, to speak on that from her end. But really, I'm hoping this podcast reaches our friends in California, those particularly in the public workspace and at smaller cities, smaller towns. We're just wondering what's coming ahead. There's very little roadmap for this type of event. And so we felt putting this information together would benefit those who just really don't have a first step in mind and may not be staffed or prepared to respond to this type of fire. So that's where I'd like it to go, at least in terms of high level.
I mean, of course, the podcast is centered around American infrastructure, and these communities own a lot of that. But Allison in particular, and of course us in assistance and others in assistance, so many people requires to build back, right? And maybe Alice can speak to that. But Allison, from the local agency side, working with FEMA and building her community back and the infrastructure and how to build back. But I think it'd be great to hear from Allison about what the communities and emotions are going through now and the expectations of the community to build back and how long that really takes under a FEMA regulatory environment. And really lately, it's very, very interesting to me is, man, the current administration is talking about ending some of these programs or stopping funding state agencies. What does that look like if there's no FEMA? And just all the emotions. I'd love to, these are real people, real communities going through tragedy. And I'd love to hear from Allison on just the emotion of it first. And then the amount of, I speak to this a lot in infrastructure about local staffs and what they really do and how hard they really work, especially in these events. So I don't know if that's something you can speak to, Allison.
Sure. I think, a lot of municipal staff are what we call lifers, where we work with an agency. The day of the fire, I'd been here 7 years. I'd worked for other municipalities as well in recovery on other disasters. But, you've worked on all of these projects in a municipality and you know the residents and you have friends and you have family here. So you're really invested in your community as a steward or a public servant for your community. So when these disasters happen, you're super concerned about all your people in your municipality, and you're watching all of your projects, your life's work burn. And so it's really hard. And you're also thinking, okay, when are we out of the response mode and when can I really jump in and hit boots on the ground to help people? So I think that's where your mindset is first, is of course public safety. And then next, how do we help people as quickly as possible? And recovery, we're 3 years out from our large fire where we lost 1,100 homes in this fire over 3 municipalities. A little bit smaller, but it still feels the same, I think, because a lot of your landmarks and projects and people's homes and belongings are gone, and there are deaths and pets that are lost. So you really want to jump in as quickly as possible to start supporting your community in all the ways that you can.
Yeah. And then you bump up against what? The funding, right? And the bureaucracy and
staffing.
and staffing.
We had 42 staff members the day of our fire. So we are a small municipality, approximately 4 square miles, but you're still giving the same amount of service as a municipality or a county with maybe 2,500 staff. You may be smaller, but it's still the same level of service and attention and processes that you have to come up with.
For me personally, in the public sector role as a staff, I unfortunately in public works, you're kind of this entity of the staff that do things. So it's kind of the one department that actually is charged with getting things, physically done. So when a community needs something physically done, often it's the public works group. In that role, unfortunately, I've had to resolve three emergency disaster situations in my career. The Estes Park flood was interesting. In 2013, Northern Colorado had a flood event. And in that role, of course, I was director, but it was the first community that saw the flooding event occurring. But post-event, this mountain community had lost all their highways or all their access. It became this remote island. All the highways to it were destroyed, and it was a very difficult situation. But what was interesting about it is when FEMA, they couldn't get there, so they flew the director of FEMA in, dropped him off, and walked in my office. And he said, "You got room for 15 people? They'll be here Monday." I'm like, "Sure." And he goes, "And they're here to help." And I'm like, "Great, could use that." But the interesting thing to me was the 2013 flood was the first FEMA action after Katrina. And in Katrina, there was so much corruption and contractors that took advantage of the old regulation. So FEMA rewrote it. And 2013 was the brand new bureaucracy of rules and regulations of the new rules. And they didn't even know how to operate it. So the FEMA staff didn't even know how to administer the new rules. They had just gotten this copy. And it was extraordinarily bureaucratic and didn't make a lot of sense. So in that regard, it was just really, really FEMA reacting to the Katrina situation, where it just cost a lot of money because they didn't have good control, and then write a bunch of rules. And now it gets very bureaucratic. Now it's hard to do anything. I felt very constrained as a local agency. And then, of course, as a consulting firm, Jay Level did assist in the Marshall Fire, which we were very excited to do, of course. But yeah, that's my history.
Awesome. Thank you.
Around that.
And just as a quick introduction for myself, Jay Blackburn, professional civil engineer, and I was the lead consultant for the town of Superior for the Marshall Fire infrastructure assessment. So I worked very closely with Scott and James throughout the recovery process, which spanned essentially from the beginning of 2022 all the way until today. And Allison, when we got lunch the other day, you said something that really kind of stuck with me. And that was, at this point, here we are removed several years from the fire. And you said, "I finally now am feeling successful and can take a deep breath." And I think I wanted to celebrate that because it is a long fight. And to hear that after several years of being in the trenches and figuring it out and dealing with these bureaucracies, to have that outlook is just amazing. And, in theory, it could take a lot longer than it did. So I think because of people like you at the town, we've seen the recovery happen at a faster pace than I had thought originally was possible. And that should be celebrated. So you and all of your team there, all the public works officials involved in this stuff, they're really heroes, and they're making these heroic decisions under tremendous stress. And as a result of my work for you guys, I was privy to see all that on a daily basis. And it just really made me respect what everybody does there for their community.
Well, Jay, we were lucky to have you, to be honest. One thing, a quick note, another thing to celebrate is that, multiple different agencies have said that we've recovered 3 times faster than the national average, which is amazing. And Scott, I also worked on that 2013 flood. And, at that time, 10 years ago, I was working or shoot, longer than 10 years ago,
That's crazy,
I
right?
was, yeah, I know. I was working for City of Boulder, and really they are just finishing up getting their payouts. So, just thinking about, how long recovery takes and how, we have this sprint of response. And then our first responders, we work with them, we're shutting on and off utilities. And, while the disaster is going on, we're moving things around, getting water pressure, all these different things. But this recovery piece is so long, and that's the marathon. So, one of the things about being in a smaller municipality is that often we don't really have emergency managers or recovery and resiliency divisions.
And funding,
We're
right? And funding is just
it's staffing, it's funding, it's not having the capacity to have this other department. We rely on our counties for our disaster management, or we have contracts with our county sheriff's departments. So, these positions like mine, which was created the Sunday after the fire, right? So it was Thursday, we're doing all of our response into Friday. Saturday, we're trying to just look at the lay of the land. Everybody's evacuated in the whole town. Staff is evacuated. Everyone is out up here. And then Sunday, you have this team meeting and it's just really quiet, and we're kind of just like, okay. And I mean, some people like myself have recovery or disaster experience. I've lived in Miami, I've lived in New Orleans, hurricanes and the flood here. And so I was like, hey, put me in, coach, right? Like, let's get moving. And so the next day, we had a disaster assistance center. We were up and running with the county and helping staff. So my former role was project management, contract and acquisition administration, community engagement, lots of different things like that. And now here I am, emergency management, recovery, resiliency, preparedness, and, project management operations for things like debris removal or our public assistance granting projects.
and I don't believe there's a disconnect between your historical experience in these, your previous experience, what you brought, and your expertise and your talent and your commitment, you as a person. It's no mystery to me that the recovery set records. And a lot of that is because of the talent and abilities and experience of staff, of people, of community workers that are devoted to their communities that bring that experience. And just congratulations. I think the two are connected to you. How fast the recovery was in a large part due to you.
Well, we were lucky. You really can't take credit for something like this. It's such a
No,
team effort,
it is for
and
sure.
people are working so hard. And even Jay, like, there were so many days he was sitting right here beside me at my desk. We're working on spreadsheets together, laughing like, trees. I'll never do trees again for a PA project.
Right,
I
right.
mean, right, Jay, you're going to recommend no trees, right?
Yes, there's a lot of lessons learned there in terms of what worked and what didn't. And, like with our granulated activated carbon system to restore the water, things that the public works director and myself and Scott had said, I don't know if that's going to be reimbursable. Like Allison trudged ahead and made it happen for the
There was a
town. And
big bet on the line for that
There
win that I
was.
got against my public works director. It's a crystal tiara that he owes me for getting that.
I think so. Yeah.
It's pretty funny.
Yeah.
so I'm interested in a little bit more discussion on the partnerships that existed, particularly within this Marshall Fire as an example, because what I'm seeing out in California is huge scale of destruction, and we're into several counties. It's not just LA County, it's Ventura County, it's down in San Diego, they're having fires now. So if you're a small district and you're understaffed, is it an advantage to partner immediately with other counties? How does that process work, and what should people be aware of if they're looking at partnering? I guess, like, who made the decision that Boulder County was going to do debris removal for all of Boulder County, including Superior and Louisville?
Yeah, so that was a really interesting decision point, of course. I think, first of all, just the understanding of the damage. So, Louisville and Superior, so there are three municipalities involved. And two of them, Louisville and Superior, were smaller municipalities, 13,000 to, I don't know, 25,000 over in Louisville. And then unincorporated Boulder County was affected. Boulder County had under 100 homes lost, and then Superior had almost 400, and then Louisville had over, I think, 500. So, these disasters really don't know jurisdictional boundaries. And like, okay, we're all in the same boat here. We're all going to have the same interactions with residents. We're all going to need to develop the same processes, and like, just maximizing and kind of coupon stacking all of your experience and capacity together just really made a lot of sense. And so for debris removal, for example, I think, the state wanted to jump in and help, and then the county started thinking about it, and they had less damage. They have 2,500 staff where we had like 42. Louisville has like 250. So, and that's from your irrigation technicians and your guest services people all the way up. Maybe not your lifeguards and your part-time staff, but you get my drift. So,
And
I
you said
think,
42 staff at Superior?
yes, 42 full-time staff, from the town manager all the way down to our full-time irrigation technician. So,
Wow.
yeah. So when you think about how do you maximize your capacity, your experience, and you're going to have the same things to develop to recover, it's automatic that you're going to glom onto each other, especially if you have good relationships. I've been here for 7 years. I worked for City of Boulder before that. I knew a lot of people in the county, and I did a lot of land management and project management and had a lot of working relationships. So I thought that was very helpful, even though I wasn't in the emergency management and recovery role here. We pivoted pretty well, and we had connections and kind of knew everybody because there's only 42 staff. You kind of know everybody. So I do think that the county, it was a gift that they gave us to help us with this. They have a lot more people than we do. But also, I was on the award team for that debris removal multi-jurisdictional project. But you always have to remember there were 50% of the residents ish opted into that and 50% ish opted out. So you also have a parallel project going on at the same time. The multi-jurisdictional was nice because it was neat, tidy, that contractor and that group managing. I mean, you were still managing ops and doing inspections and making sure they were doing what they had to do. But meanwhile, your simultaneous residents hiring hundreds of contractors to do their own was a whole nother ball game that was going on at the same time. So, you're already going to have your own projects and operations standalone with a multi-jurisdictional approach. So,
And what you're speaking to, Allison, for the listener, is the initial debris removal left over by the fire. And
hazardous waste,
yeah,
right?
EPA regs came in and started playing a role saying this stuff's hazardous waste, which was, for a lot of people would be like, well, really? That's a surprise. There's a
Yeah, heavy
whole,
metals and batteries and
yeah, it's a very expensive determination when you say this is hazardous. It has to be bagged up and taken to a hazardous landfill that can deal with it correctly. And now it's very expensive. And so you guys got together and issued one contract for this, but the homeowners had to sign something saying it's okay for you to come and remove all of my debris off of my property.
yeah, right of entry.
Right of entry. So there was a process, a cumbersome process, right? And people are like, wait a minute, how much is this going to cost me? Maybe I should get my own. I don't trust your contractor's fee, right?
Or can we move faster than your contractor, which in most cases they could not. We moved much faster just because of economy of scale and being able to take a whole block at a time. So, there were even people that wanted to do their own, and we got to their block, to that runway for operations, and gave them a call. Hey, so do you want to sign up? We're here, we're there. And I mean, I think the cost, in my opinion, was fabulous in the multi-jurisdictional program because it was really typically what your insurance would pay out for debris removal. Maybe it's, every policy is different, but maybe it was 5%, maybe it was 5,000, maybe it was 20,000 was like a really high end payout for an insurance policy for debris removal. But then, if there was debris that needed to be removed, like outside of the ash footprint, I mean, it's very complex what would be covered and what wouldn't by a FEMA multi jurisdictional program. But then, say you had a tree left after the debris removal, you could remove that and during the insurance reconciliation piece of that project, provide invoices to defer that amount and not have to remit that insurance debris removal cost. It's really complicated though.
That is true. It is very complicated, and no two things are ever the same twice, right? I think what I'd like to hear a little bit more on from you, Allison, is just for the listeners in California who are in this situation and, they're wondering what to do in terms of their questions. Like Scott said, why is this taking so long? And I was watching the news last night, and the news anchor was standing outside Palisades, and he was saying just that residents are wondering why this is taking so long. Why can't they start cleaning up? There's such a complicated structure in place, or being put in place currently, that will provide for that. But in our case, in Superior, took almost 6 months for the debris to get removed entirely by that multi-jurisdictional project. Is that right?
Well, if you're talking about the actual beginning of the work to the end, of boots on the ground, it took 100 days, unprecedented, super fast. Part of the issue is you have to go through this complex procurement. It's a federal procurement because you want to get reimbursed by FEMA. So everything has to be, a formal federal procurement. You have to really button that up. And then, you have to do all of your correct documentation. The other piece is you're getting your municipalities together and your electeds together to kind of give up a little bit of control and, maybe a little bit of pre conversations before a disaster can help with that. So there's a little bit of like push and pull with your elected officials thinking about, are we going to relinquish some of this control, which of course you are. It's out of your magnitude. When you go to the next level, that means it's overwhelmed everything that you have. And that's why things are declared disasters, right? Just thinking about trying to get your team together, you're agreeing on your scope of work for all the municipalities that are involved. Then you get your bids in and you can rack and stack those numbers different ways depending on what type of debris there is on the ground. There's different categories. There's appliances and white goods. There's cars. There's concrete, and you're figuring out what those bids look like and trying to determine who's going to give you the best service and for the cost, really. And then you're going to have bid protests. You're going to have other agencies that come in. This is a large dollar amount contract. Anytime there's a large job, there's pretty much always going to be at least one bid protest or two. So those can cause delays. There's also pieces where the state may not have regulations in place or your process internally. You want to all agree that, like our three different municipalities, okay, how are we going to test for hazardous materials post debris removal to ensure that all of this waste is gone? So there's lots of different pieces to get it rolling. And then making sure, checking with FEMA and the state through the whole process to ensure that you're going to be eligible for reimbursement. So I think that's some of the pieces. I think the fire happened, end of December. And I think we were done with debris removal by June. But from the first piece being removed and the truck's out there, it was 100 days, which was amazing. And everybody really worked really hard to get that going. But when you get a protest, you can't press forward. I mean, you could still work on your processes and honing in and ensuring that that's going to be a smooth operation, but you cannot work.
You just never know until you're there. And that's a great segue actually into one of my next questions, which is about contracting and process. And what I'd like to say before that to our listeners is just that we're here to help you guys with this type of stuff if it's not familiar to you. There's a boatload of time in writing these contracts and requests for proposals and making sure that it's in line with your own procurement policy and the federal regulations. And the harsh truth is basically that you get one shot at these projects. You don't get to go back to FEMA and say, oh, by the way, we added some extra stuff to this project. And that makes your efforts a lot more challenging up front because you've got a plan, you've got to group like damages into manageable projects that are going to clearly show replacement in kind versus what was previous. And so I do want to talk a little bit about that in terms of betterment and how we can build back infrastructure better, because that obviously the podcast is about infrastructure, but
Looking for a new opportunity? Interested in being part of an expanding network of independent engineers and architects who are thinking differently? Level Design Partners is on a mission to create prosperity for design professionals, the industry, and the world, using innovative business systems and a culture of collaboration. We believe that traditional education and firm structures want you to be a cog in their machine, depriving you of key skills needed to thrive, thus commoditizing an entire industry in the process. Gain access to skills, tools, and systems by partnering with Level Design Partners. Learn more at leveldesignpartners.com.
in terms of our contracting requirements, do you have any advice or wisdom that we can offer our listeners in terms of what they should be doing and focusing on? And also, of course, that we're here to help if they have questions on those high level contractings and similar things.
Well, I mean, that really makes me think about how you want to do a project and how FEMA will reimburse it and the differences between those. I think that codes and updates for infrastructure projects can be very different from where they were at pre-fire. And so the way that FEMA reimburses is, like you said, like for like. And if it's an improved project, it's harder to get payment for that. And so if you're thinking about asphalt, let's talk about our asphalt project, Jay. So that's a classic one right there. So you're waiting to do your asphalt because you've got all the contractors rebuilding resident homes, you have parks that are being rebuilt, you have different infrastructure. So you have lots of contractors out there. You wait to do your asphalt, your roads in your neighborhoods until as far as you can push them out because you know there's going to be damage, right? And the way FEMA reimburses is kind of like replacing the holes in Swiss cheese. So maybe you had a few cars burned on a street, and then those are your holes. And so FEMA says, okay, you can patch those Swiss cheese holes from the burned cars, but you can't repave the whole block. And of course, we know we have to repave the whole block because within a couple of years, what's going to happen? Cars are going to drive over it. Your patches are going to kind of be divots. And so,
Can we pause on that for a second?
Sure.
Because I'm totally interested in that all over again.
Oh, he's geeking out.
I know. We geek out on similar things.
And you know this. You made the analogy of Swiss cheese. You probably explained it to FEMA in a similar way. We have these localized damages to our asphalt. We know we actually have to mill and replace more asphalt to make that right again. And they said, oh, well, it's only the damage we can see. And so that's kind of where our engineering team came in and said, well, let's look at this in terms of a project, because we're not only just going to put asphalt in the hole where it's missing, we've got to go and saw cut, and we were going to impact the sidewalk and, XYZ. And so that's where the engineering experts can make cases for the town to try and get quantities reimbursed in a way that actually matches reality. And so it went probably 3 different rounds with FEMA and trying to get them to understand the concept of how to replace asphalt, eventually to be accepted. But you've got to go through it, and you've got to have your ducks in a row.
And
And
your narratives are really
yeah,
important. Also, the way you rack and stack your projects in the FEMA reimbursement portals, like it can be racked and stacked many different ways. And like, what are the ways that are really going to bring in that reimbursement, and how are they organized, and what are the narratives? What are the stories? Because I think your project managers on the FEMA side are going to change. I think that we've had 4 in the last 3 years. So our fire occurred about 3 years ago. So just thinking about how you're racking and stacking those projects and kind of setting them up for success right from the get-go, even though things will move around, things will change, which is fine, but like even invoicing or how you're grouping these projects together. So I think, yeah, the Swiss cheese effect. Things disappear.
Yeah. I just want to contextually talk about real quickly, just briefly, is the amount of damage that your community, the total, what was it? What it was?
In 2021, Superior's budget was $51.5 million, and the damage costs to date are approximately $12.5 million total for our infrastructure so far. With a few more costs that are left that are not included, we still have a asphalt project to perform. The FEMA percentages for this disaster, and we were very lucky with the coverage that was provided. It was at a 75% covered for firefighting expenses for response efforts, and 90% for public assistance infrastructure project costs. Also, to be calculated into this equation is tax revenues. And of course, people were displaced and stores needed mitigation and were closed and took, months to get back up and running. And the estimation for this tax revenues that were lost from the fire damage was approximately $4 million.
Our communities are a business, basically. You can't absorb your total annual budget. I remember Estes Park was almost 10 years budget of the cost to rebuild. It's just not feasible. You have to play the FEMA game. You can't opt out. You can't afford to opt out. So when the community goes, get things done, you get pressure from your community to say, get it done. You go, we got to follow FEMA because we can't afford not to. If I recall right, on that particular disaster, you were getting 80% reimbursement was really all you could get if you did everything right. The state, I think, kicked in maybe another 10, but you still had to come up with money, often.
Yeah, actually, we were lucky. I think a lot of our negotiations with FEMA through the state, we ended up getting a 90% reimbursement, which was unheard of. Even having the foundations removed for our residents was unprecedented here. So I think our negotiations went really well, but you still have to think in your Swiss cheese effect scenario. So like you can say, yeah, 90%, woo, we pay 5%, the state pays 5, and then, however that goes through FEMA, but then that's only stuff that was really covered. And so that asphalt street, sure, the Swiss cheese holes were covered, but not
Right.
a major thoroughfare, right?
So, Allison, do you think how valuable is it to have people in the know for that reimbursement, to get as much reimbursement as possible?
It is really integral to set up those projects right, to start off your documentation and your procurement right, to get support wherever you can from others that have experienced this or worked through it. They have lots of lessons learned, like Jay and I will never do trees again. You can get volunteers or a little grant for that. Just don't do it.
What was the challenge with trees? Now I have to know.
Oh, so the guidance in the Papa G, which is the FEMA guide for FEMA for public assistance for trees, is it's a certain girth of a tree at shoulder height. And you're like, how tall am I? How tall are my parks guys? And it's a percentage of the crown that doesn't grow back. But then we're 3 years out and the trees look like they might come back. So we kind of waited because that stock is super expensive and important for our canopy, our tree canopy. So 3 years later, trees died that they didn't think would die. And your infrastructure is damaged, your irrigation is damaged. Colorado, high plains out here, you're in the plains. Everything has to have irrigation. So then you're hand watering trees until you get your irrigation back up and running. So there's lots of different nuances to that. You have to drop a locate. You put a pin where that tree is, the measurements, you have your arborist or your, whoever's certified as an arborist go around and, you probably had pre-documentation. We had pre-documentation of all of our like tree health. I mean, it's just so complicated.
It's fighting an uphill battle from the beginning because FEMA doesn't pay for any landscaping or vegetation as a whole. They'll tell you that we're not paying for things that grow because that's not part of our infrastructure. So
But if it's a safety and it's against a sidewalk,
exactly, if it's a hazard to public health, then those trees were ultimately accepted, but the criteria is a bit subjective. And so it did end up not being worth the squeeze, I think, on that one. But nonetheless, all the hazard trees got removed, and we are proud of that at least.
And we have more that have now died that we're going to be removing this year. But we went for a volunteer project on that one, so we were pretty happy.
I have one thing to add real quick, and it's just that in the assessment phase, which is currently happening, so you're assessing what damage there is so many unknowns in terms of what's damaged. For example, our sanitary sewer system in Superior. Well, it's 8 feet deep, largely, and made of PVC. But with the temperatures we were seeing, that destroyed concrete and asphalt, caused the asphalt to burn off all of its tar, and it caused the concrete sidewalks to explode because they expanded so much. We thought, well, there's a good chance there's some damage to the sanitary sewer system, whether it's at the surface level or down at the pipe level. You shouldn't be afraid to go and investigate any potential damages. And so what we did in this case was run a sewer video camera through most of the town's sewer to confirm there wasn't damage or, melted pipes or things in the sewer that would clog it up. So that ultimately didn't reveal much damage at all, maybe a few manhole lids and things, but the sewer was in great shape, and that was good news. The money we spent to investigate that was covered by FEMA. So I guess what I'm trying to say is if you're not sure where the holes in the Swiss cheese are, go ahead and do the work to figure out where the holes in the Swiss cheese are. And that money's covered as reimbursable.
And there are timelines for these things, right? So if you're doing your emergency operations, you need to make sure that you know that reimbursement stops here, and then maybe your flushing of your hydrants and things to keep contaminants out of your systems. That's going to go on for a long time after your deadline for your emergency operations piece. So you need to make sure you're racking and stacking these tasks, these work items in another area or another project. So anyway, just thinking about the nuances of these things where, yes, we're flushing, we're keeping contaminants out. That's emergency operations. Well, not after 6 months or not after 3 months, right? So what do those timelines look like for these different tasks for you?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, let's talk a little bit about building back. We've, let's say, gotten through some of the assessments and we're ready to go ahead and replace this infrastructure. Talking roads, or we're talking bridges, evacuation routes that people are going to need in the future. Their houses, how are they going to survive fires better in the future? All of that's in question right now. And, what we've talked about to date on this podcast is just kind of the contrary of that, is we're going to build back to what it was before. Well, how do we try and better the outcome by using these dollars? And And I'll start with maybe a example from Superior. So we lost a retaining wall or several retaining walls that were timbers, landscape timbers and 4 or 5 feet tall, burned out completely. And so the town doesn't want to replace those with old timbers again. We have new modular block walls that are actually cheaper than timbers at this point. So that was one where we successfully negotiated a betterment, and I believe that's capped at about 15% of the loss value, so to speak. So we were able to spend, instead of $100,000, $115,000 putting back a new Allen block wall.
Yeah, which is exciting for residents too, because, they've been impacted, they're rebuilding, they've got this infrastructure project or a retaining wall right outside their backyard, right? And they know that that burned. They walked around, they saw everything. You don't want to replace like for like. You don't want another timber wall that's going to burn behind your neighborhood home. You want something that is hardened against and resilient against these disasters.
Perfect. I love that example. It's a clean walk away. Everybody can see the difference. And yeah, it was all covered by FEMA. So thank you, FEMA. I mean, that's what they're there for.
Our pump station as well. We had a pump station for one of our reservoirs and it burned. And we replaced that with a complete cement building, fire hardened. I mean, we replaced that building with our insurance, but then we received mitigation dollars over and above our insurance from FEMA, the way that, I set up that project so that, we were able to replace the building, but with a fire hardened structure and materials from the FEMA dollars. So, there are programs, but you need to know where to dig. You need to know how to set that up. And then you need to make sure it's pretty airtight to get that reimbursement.
Love it.
Doesn't always work though. Sometimes it does. It's a little bit of a gamble, but you just really want to set those up as best as you can for success. And then hopefully they come through.
We could talk more maybe buildings themselves. Like this point here, we saw the need for building back to a new code in Sagamore and Rock Creek. A lot of these homes that were lost are from the 80s, built under a completely different code. So when the town gave guidance to the residents as they were redesigning and rebuilding their houses, all of a sudden the 2021 building code is in play, the residential building code, which requires fire sprinklers. Now that's an extra cost versus what they had before, right? People aren't super happy or thrilled about being told, hey, you've got to pay 15, 20,000 more than otherwise to put in a fire sprinkler because the code says it. So
especially when you're on average 250,000 underinsured.
Right.
And so what ended up happening is the town decided to allow opting out of the fire sprinkler requirement. And Allison, you blew me away when you said 70% of the homes that have been built back actually put in the fire sprinklers and did things fully to the code on their own accord.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they actually put in the fire sprinklers, but they definitely, in some way, shape, or form, built way over and above, built back, more sustainable and energy efficient, and hitting all of these different pieces that they didn't have to do. And that was because of the rebates and the different programs that rolled out through different state, local, federal help that people were able to receive. And so it kind of offset those extra costs, which was great.
It's funny how the private side tends to get its way in that sense. Like I was making the analogy that it almost can be more complicated and costly to ask a builder not to build to current code because that's what they're generally building to. And so consistency and those type of things really matter in terms of the rebuilding. And unfortunately, that looked like in Superior, some of the homes or a lot of the homes going in with a large developer, and the large developer doing a lot of the building kind of in in phases or in big chunks, and some good, some bad, I'm sure, from that. But it definitely changed the look of the neighborhood, changed the feel of the neighborhood. And I did want to come back to a point kind of more on the human side with emotions and how people are feeling after this type of event, and that it doesn't go away very soon. And people who are in their new homes, Allison, you told me this, and maybe you can elaborate, but people who are back in their new homes are reporting feeling like it's an alternate reality of sorts, and they're kind of lost in their own home because it's not the same as what it was, and it doesn't have the context of what they remember.
Yeah, so that term is called synestalgia, and it's kind of akin to nostalgia, right? We miss something that can't be had anymore. But this is they're in their home. They pick these neighborhoods and these communities because of the open space. There's now fear of the open spaces and the natural environment. All their landmarks are gone. Their belongings are gone from their homes, and just that feeling of loss. So it doesn't feel like home anymore. And akin to this is thinking about trauma informed care training for your staff. Now, we in Superior didn't lose anyone, any staff members after this event. And you could probably look at the statistics. You typically have a mass hemorrhage after an event like this because it's so hard on staff, dealing with 2 to 6,000 emails a day in your inbox, right? And being at the Disaster Assistance Center with the grief and loss of your residents and trying to help them. And, if you've been there a long time, you're holding them, right? So, this trauma informed care training, because your staff is at the Disaster Assistance Center, they are going to deal with residents in the different stages of grief and loss, anger, and just being distraught and needing help and overwhelmed with work, and helping them year over year through these processes, through the permits, through the inspections, trying to help them with their insurance companies and payouts and things like that, like really trying to help your residents. So I think that piece of knowing the language to use with fire families or families that are recovering from disaster with you is super important. And also being able to identify your personal wellness, that staff person that's there dealing with these emotions and this work day after day, year after year, and until someone has rebuilt and they're still feeling loss, right? With this nostalgia that we're talking about. So, that trauma informed care, I cannot stress enough. I feel like a lot of places didn't help their staff through that. And I think it's one of the reasons we didn't lose people. And I think it's one of the reasons that I'm still here, to be frank, because it is, I'm still calling. We've got 49 parcels that are not rebuilt 3 years later. Last week, we called every one of those families to check in, talk about deadlines for these funding resources. There's a lot of one on one support. When the larger case management is over, you start the case management with your people until that's stood up, which was 6 months for us. And then when that case management is not there any longer, you are back in the game for case management. And you never really leave it because people are always, oh, I got a problem with this, or I need help with that. So just being aware of that personal wellness piece, protecting your staff, and making sure that they have this trauma informed care training.
Wow, just such an amazing resource for the community out there. You're such a wealth of knowledge on that stuff. It's a whole new world for us engineers getting into that side of
That's why
things.
you have project managers to talk to. It's always the engineers and the project managers,
Again, it takes such a big team to do this, and you're such a big cog in that wheel, kind of at the middle, keeping all these other people going, us being one of them, and playing that teamwork role all the way through. I mean, we're still responding to RFIs from FEMA
Yep.
on miscellaneous damages, and we're not billing you guys for that. We're like, let's get this thing done. Let's get her
I
Get
know.
her
Can I
to the
have a
phone.
letter, Jay? By the way, I need a letter. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Well, here's kind of a testament to the progress. Jay's been sharing a ton of photos, and I've been trying to show, contrast. And obviously, you can see here, this is the playscape. And when Jay showed me this picture, I thought it was a rendering. I mean, it literally looks fake.
Beautiful. The chef's kiss. And the homes and the home. I mean, I got to tell you, when you started hearing the hammers out there and the rebuilding and seeing the foundations being poured, I would just go out there for my joy, you know?
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. That's probably not talked about enough. Just the emotional side of, I mean, obviously, if you're experiencing it and you're a homeowner or you live in the area, that's so emotional, the whole thing. But on the engineering side, the infrastructure side, this whole process, the emotional toll that can take on someone working in it or involved, like that's probably not talked about enough. So appreciate you sharing.
And FEMA can have this negative conversation when you say FEMA, when you're in it and the struggles of getting reimbursed, and the rest of the countries struggle with paying for FEMA for the money. Their money is going to some other place like a coastline. Why are we paying to rebuild those people? I'm in Iowa. There's a lot of negativity around this, but I have to say that the FEMA insurance programs in general create jobs in America. And so what we're talking about is these are monies that recirculate in our economies, building better. It's not lost. The FEMA program in general it's necessary with global climate change and what we're facing with these situations. But also, let's not make it negative. It is job creation too in our country.
I got to tell you, our region, we're in Region 8 here in Colorado. They have been really good. Like, I know that like these boxes have to be ticked. You have to go through the rule playbook and you have to do it the right way. But like many of these project managers that are working for FEMA, like the ones we work with, really tried to help, but their capacity is also tapped. And so they can help, but you really need to do this on your own or with your team, you know, because stuff can fall through the cracks. You need somebody that is on your side and is your teammate and watching out for you and cheerleading you on so that you're going to get as much reimbursement as you can, because those guys have a lot of different municipalities that have been hit by other disasters. And as a year goes on, or 6 months, or 2 years goes on, they've been assigned 3 more because we know that these disasters are happening more and more. So you really need to have your good core team doing these assessments, organizing these projects, and continuing to work with you throughout this period of getting all the work done and finishing up the reimbursements.
Yeah, it certainly is kind of an all in approach. And like with those big challenges in any aspect of life, you need a team, you need support, or you're going to burn out, right? It's not just a 6 month thing. You're going to be in this for 3-4 years at a minimum to really see it through. And so celebrate that teamwork and support. You need
Yeah,
it.
and just thinking about your asphalt, like if it's the last thing to go, it's your last project, and you end up having to do like a small project reconciliation with FEMA, we're 3 years out. It'll be 3.5 years. We should be finishing up our asphalt, or maybe 3 years, 8 months. I don't know, Jay.
Sometime this fall, I think it's going to go down, is what Brandon was saying.
Yeah. So 10 months, 3 years and 10 months, we'll have wrapped up all of our projects, completed all of the work for our infrastructure side, our public property side. And then we'll have to do a small project reconciliation with anything under $1 million, any project under $1 million. So it'll be fun.
Is that what a small project is these days? Anything under $1 million?
Yeah, unfortunately, the policy changed mid-disaster for us, and we had racked and stacked our projects a certain way, which I may have rethought if that was going to happen, if I had known that was going to happen, but you don't. So you really have to have people watching out for those types of things. And if you get thrown a curveball, you just kind of figure it out on the fly, right?
Right, right. Miles, what comes to mind for you as you listen to all this?
Yeah, outsider's perspective, right? A lot of it is foreign. It's wild to think about this side of disaster and tragedy and building back the engineering, the infrastructure, all the people. I don't know. I'm amazed at how complicated it actually is. And for anyone to come in and oversimplify it and just,
And
question.
communications, we didn't even touch on communications.
Yeah.
Like, oh my goodness, I can't even tell you how many newsletters and like paying attention to social media, having people scout for us on social media to make sure misinformation wasn't being spread for people that really don't have the time and energy to get spun up in a tornado in a different direction. And so communications, monitoring what's going on in the community to make sure like, oh, this process, this happened. How can I be flexible? How can I change it? Will it impact everybody in this process? Can I fix it? Because you're creating these things on the fly, you're really trying to do a good job, but you're always like scouting for the next improvement for that. So communications is a whole nother ball of wax
Yeah. Wow.
because people need info.
100%. Yeah. In a 2025 AI, social world, social media. Yeah. I would imagine there's a lot of evolution coming to this part of your work as well. So that's really interesting.
Yes. Websites. So we had to build 2 websites. We had new newsletters. I mean, and your departments are having to do that, or your recovery manager, paying attention to all the different grants and funding that's available and all the different deadlines and making sure residents are getting that. And then working with all the departments to make sure, road closures and, you know, neighborhood closures and barricades. And, so there's lots of that communication going on.
Let's wrap up like this. And whoever wants to jump in, but 30,000 foot view, zoom out. Who are we speaking to? I mean, a lot of people, but district managers, town managers, who am I missing?
Yeah, small cities, small municipalities, districts for the most part. Anyone who's got public infrastructure that's damaged and it's not insured.
What are the first few steps that you can take to kind of start to get some momentum and get the right people in your corner?
I think the most important thing is, as a staff, you are motivated to just start doing things and just calling up your contractor buddy and get out here, do this, do that, do this. Or even remember the sheriff situation in Superior. It's like, and you start pulling the trigger and you don't have your ducks in a row, you don't get reimbursed. And what you're doing is damaging your community more than the damage itself. And to slow down enough to say, okay, I'm going to need to get reimbursed. I need somebody to help me through this, because you are very motivated as a staff to start getting things done. But if you don't do it right, you're going to get in trouble.
Yeah, I think you're thinking about Louisville, but that's okay.
Oh, sorry, it's okay.
We have Boulder County sheriffs here. We have a contract with them, and we had hundreds of out of jurisdiction sheriff support come in, and we documented all their hours and where they were. And they were here for public safety, as far as going into the neighborhoods with these dangerous, hazardous materials. And so you've got to document who they are every hour, what their vehicle is, and then that goes into your emergency operations project. So we did a great job.
But if you don't do it, what happens?
I mean, and language matters. So, there's different language that you could use around what their services are for. And ours was for neighborhood safety. And, if any other words from different groups get enmeshed in that, things like that may not be covered. So language really matters. Yeah.
Yeah. Slow down is my message.
Yeah.
Read
that Papa G.
Yeah. And get some help on navigating FEMA.
Yeah, get some help. And I mean, look to your neighbors that are with you in the disaster. Look for your groups of people that have experience for sure.
I think we were going to say similar things there. Just staffing up, making sure you're prepared and feeling like you've got the resources. Otherwise, it's if you don't do it when you have a minute to calm down and take a breath right now, you won't. You'll go 3 years without putting those things in place, and it's going to be very dependent on your own district guidelines and T&Cs and what your procurement policy says. And we're here to help you with those things, honestly, because those really matter more than you might think immediately. But just getting that structure in place is huge.
And hiring your consulting team is reimbursable too.
Right.
Yes.
It's covered.
Allison, thank you so much for taking the time and having this conversation. Really appreciate it.
Allison, it's good to see you. Yeah.
I know. Good to see you too. It's great seeing you guys. And I appreciate, the opportunity to share our lessons together and what we worked on together.
Thanks for listening. If you found value in this episode, support us by sharing it with someone or leaving a review. In upcoming episodes, we'll discuss the realities of the industry today and what the future may look like. It's our belief that positive changes for architects and engineers is not the obligation of the industry, but rather a choice you make to reimagine how we work together. We invite you to join us in creating a world in which design professionals thrive. Learn about our mission and get involved by following us wherever you listen to podcasts and subscribing to our newsletter at leveldesignpartners.com.